Tony Hsieh died in November 2020 in a storage room attached to a friend's Connecticut home. He'd locked himself inside. There was a fire. He was 46. By that point, he'd already stepped down from Zappos months earlier and was giving away money in Las Vegas in ways people around him were starting to find concerning. But we're not starting there. I want to tell you about something that happened way before any of that, and you probably won't understand why it matters until later. Maybe not even by the end. Yo, what's up guys? It's your boy Jordan here again, and this is my third video documenting and breaking down some of the craziest success stories out there. Boy, this one, it's something else. So don't forget to hit that subscribe button, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from, and let's get into it. Let's go. In 1999, Tony Hsieh met Nick Swinmurn in a San Francisco cafe. Nick had an idea about selling shoes online. Tony had just sold his first company, Link Exchange, to Microsoft for $265 million. He was 24 years old when he sold it. He didn't particularly enjoy running it by the end. The culture had shifted as it grew, and he found himself avoiding the office. There's this detail in interviews where he talks about how Link Exchange started with him and his friends, and it felt like a party every day. And then they had to hire people who were competent but didn't share that initial energy. And slowly, the thing he built became a place he didn't want to be. So here's Nick talking about shoes, and Tony's listening, and what he's hearing is nobody thinks this will work. Nick had been pitching venture capitalists, and they were, not to put too fine a point on it, laughing. Shoes online. You can't try them on. You can't touch them. Return rates would destroy you. Margins are bad. Footwear, etc., and all these other companies already tried and failed. The whole idea seemed stupid to people who supposedly knew what they were talking about. The story people tell now is that Tony saw something others didn't. But if you actually look at what happened, it's murkier. Tony didn't immediately say yes. He put in $500,000, but as an advisor and investor, not as CEO. He had this idea that he wanted to be in the background. He was funding it, helping, but Nick was running it. Tony had money from the Microsoft sale, and he was doing what a lot of young tech people with sudden wealth do: angel investing, advising, trying to figure out what comes next. They called it Shoesite.com at first, then Zappos from Zapatos, Spanish for shoes. Someone thought it sounded better. For the first year or so, Tony stayed mostly hands-off, and the company it was doing something, but it wasn't working. Not really. They didn't have inventory. They were taking orders and then buying shoes from retail stores to ship to customers. Think about that for a second. They were literally going to physical shoe stores, buying shoes at retail price, then selling them online, often at a loss just to fulfill orders and keep customers happy. They were hemorrhaging money in a way that wasn't sustainable even by .com boom standards. And this was during the boom, when people were lighting money on fire for way stupider ideas. By 2000, Tony was more involved, still not CEO but deeper in. And then the .com crash happened. You remember that, or you've heard about it. Capital dried up everywhere. All those venture capitalists who were throwing money at anything with a website suddenly got very careful very fast. Zappos needed funding and nobody wanted to give it to them. They went through something like 20 rejections from VCs. 20. People who were already skeptical about selling shoes online became even more skeptical when the market crashed. Tony ended up putting in more of his own money to keep it alive. Then more. Then more. At some point, he'd invested so much of his Microsoft money into Zappos that walking away would mean losing everything. He was pot committed, in poker terms. And Tony actually was into poker. He'd later write about how a lot of business is just poker with different variables. At some point, and the exact moment isn't clear from what's documented, Tony became CEO. It wasn't announced like some triumphant thing. It just sort of happened. He was already doing the job. Nick stepped back and Tony stepped forward, and that was that. Here's what nobody tells you about those early years. They almost died constantly. Not once, not twice, constantly. In 2001, they had to lay off half the staff. Half. Tony moved the whole operation from San Francisco to Las Vegas because San Francisco was too expensive. Rent was killing them. Vegas had cheaper office space and cheaper labor and no state income tax. So they packed up and moved to Nevada. The thing is, they were still losing money. In 2003, they did about $70 million in gross sales sales, but they weren't profitable. 2004, about $184 million in sales, still not profitable. Tony kept having to decide whether to put more of his own Microsoft money in or let it collapse, and he kept choosing to put more in. There's something almost compulsive about it, the way he kept betting on this thing that kept not quite working. The thing people misunderstand is they think Zappos succeeded because of some brilliant insight about customer service. But customer service wasn't the strategy at first. What actually happened is messier. They were failing at everything else. Marketing wasn't working well enough. The technology was fine but not special. They couldn't compete on price with Amazon or other big retailers. So they started obsessing over the one thing they could maybe control completely: how people felt when they interacted with them. Free shipping both ways. 365-day return policy. A call center that didn't have time limits on calls or scripts. If you called Zappos at 2 a.m. and wanted to talk for 3 hours about your life, they'd talk to you. There are documented cases of service reps staying on calls for over 10 hours, not because they were required to, because that was the culture Tony was building. One famous story has a rep staying on the phone with a customer for 10.5 hours. 10.5 hours. About shoes, about life, about whatever. And you have to understand, this wasn't normal. This wasn't some feel-good corporate messaging thing. The metrics were bizarre. Most call centers measure success by how quickly they get you off the phone. Average handle time. Calls per hour. Tony told his reps the opposite. He wanted them to create emotional connections. He started measuring success by repeat customers and word of mouth, not quarterly profits. He didn't care if a call took 5 minutes or 5 hours. He cared if that person told their friends about Zappos. Wall Street would have hated this if Zappos had been public. Investors did hate it. They kept asking when he'd optimize, when he'd cut costs, when he'd make the operation leaner. Standard business school stuff. And Tony just didn't. He kept spending money on things that didn't have clear ROI. Free shipping both ways costs a fortune. Generous return policies cost a fortune. A call center with no efficiency metrics costs a fortune. But slowly it started working. Not dramatically, not overnight, just slowly. Repeat customer rates were insane. Something like 75% of their sales were from repeat customers. People would call just to chat. They'd order multiple sizes of the same shoe, try them on at home, return the ones that didn't fit. Zappos ate the cost and smiled about it. By 2004, they were finally approaching profitability. By 2005, they hit it. By 2007, they were doing over $840 million in revenue. By 2008, over $1 billion. They had something like 1,500 employees, most of them in that Vegas warehouse and call center. The Zappos company culture became this whole thing. Tony developed 10 core values. Deliver while through service. Embrace and drive change. Create fun and a little weirdness. Be adventurous, creative, and open-minded. A few others. They printed these on cards. They made new hires go through a month of training, and at the end of training, they'd offer people $2,000 to quit if they didn't feel the culture fit. Most didn't take it. The ones who stayed bought in completely. It was cult-like in some descriptions, though people who worked there usually describe it more positively. They'd have parades through the office. They decorated their cubicles in weird ways. There was this manufactured zaniness to it that some people loved and some people found exhausting. But Tony believed in it. He talked about it constantly. Company culture, core values, happiness. He wrote this book in 2010 called Delivering Happiness. It sold well. People quoted it in business schools. But if you read it carefully, there's something off about the way he talks. He's obsessed with happiness as a tangible outcome, not just for customers, for employees, for himself. He writes about happiness like it's a formula he's trying to solve. Like if you just get the variables right, you can engineer joy. But here's what actually happened with the business. Amazon tried to compete with them directly with a site called Endless.com. Shoes, same model. It didn't work. Zappos had already won the culture war. They had the customer loyalty. So in 2009, Amazon did what Amazon does when it can't beat you. It bought you. $1.2 billion in stock. 9 years. From laughed out of VC meetings to $1 billion acquisition. That's the story people know. Tony stayed on as CEO. Amazon, surprisingly, let Zappos operate pretty independently. The deal was structured that way. Tony negotiated hard for autonomy. He wanted to keep the culture intact. And for a while, Amazon respected that. For a while, it seemed fine. Zappos kept doing its thing. Tony kept doing his thing. But his thing was getting stranger. He became obsessed with something called Holacracy. This management structure with no job titles, no managers, just self-organizing circles of workers. It's complicated, and most people who have tried to explain it end up sounding like they're in a cult. He implemented it at Zappos in 2013. A lot of employees hated it. It was confusing. Decision-making became unclear. Nobody knew who was responsible for what. In 2015, he offered another buyout to anyone who didn't want to stick with Holacracy. About 18% of the company, several hundred people, took it and left. Then there was Downtown Project. Tony moved to Las Vegas full-time and decided he was going to revitalize downtown. Not the Strip, downtown, the old part. He pledged $350 million of his own money. He funded startups, bought buildings, invested in restaurants and bars and art installations. He wanted to create community from scratch. He talked about serendipity and collisions, the idea that if you get enough interesting people in close proximity, magic happens. He moved into a former city hall building that he converted into apartments. He wanted entrepreneurs and artists living together, running into each other, collaborating. He'd throw parties. He'd walk around downtown at all hours talking to people. He was trying to engineer community the way he'd engineered customer service at Zappos. It didn't work the way he wanted. A lot of the startups failed. Some of the entrepreneurs complained about unclear expectations and chaotic management. Money would appear and disappear. Projects would get funded and then abandoned. There were suicides among people involved in the project, at least 5 over several years, which is more than you'd statistically expect from a group that size. People started asking questions about the culture Tony was creating, about the pressure, about what happened when the happiness formula broke down. By 2020, things were clearly unraveling. Tony stepped down from Zappos in August. The reasons given were vague, pursuing other interests or something like that. He was spending time in Park City, Utah, then Connecticut. People around him were worried. He was reportedly using nitrous oxide heavily, whippets, drinking, not sleeping right, buying properties impulsively. There are documented stories of him offering strangers large sums of money for strange reasons. Friends tried interventions. Family got involved. But Tony was private about what he was going through, and also he had hundreds of millions of dollars, which makes it hard for people to tell you no or force you to get help. On November 18, 2020, he barricaded himself in a shed attached to a house in New London, Connecticut. The house belonged to his girlfriend's family, I think. The details are unclear. There was a fire. Nobody knows exactly what happened. He was pulled out but had severe smoke inhalation and burns. He died 9 days later at a hospital in Bridgeport. The coroner ruled it an accident. Some reports suggested he'd been doing whippets and had candles and a propane heater in the shed and something ignited. Others said he'd been struggling with substance abuse and mental health and had isolated himself. His brother was there, trying to get him to come out. He wouldn't. His family released a statement. His friends said kind things. The business world eulogized him as a visionary, a guy who changed e-commerce, a guy who proved customer service could be a competitive advantage, a guy who showed that culture matters. What's documented is this: he built something people said couldn't work. He got laughed out of meetings by people who supposedly knew better. He spent years hemorrhaging money on an idea that seemed stupid. He kept betting on it when rational people would have walked away. He sold it for over $1 billion. He spent years trying to engineer happiness for customers, for employees, for communities, for himself. He wrote a book about it, and at the end, he died alone in a storage shed in Connecticut, in circumstances that remain somewhat unclear. I don't know what that means. I don't think trying to extract a lesson from it makes sense. The business succeeded. The life ended badly. Those two things exist next to each other, and you can make whatever pattern you want out of them, but the pattern isn't in the facts. The facts are just facts. He was laughed out of meetings for wanting to sell shoes online. Then he built Zappos. Then Amazon bought it. Then he tried to remake downtown Las Vegas. Then he died in a fire. That's what happened.